When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart didn't skip a beat out of fear of being caught, it froze because I knew exactly what he was about to find. Those messages. The ones I thought I'd deleted. I reached for the phone instinctively, but he jerked it back with a sharpness that told me he wasn't just reading. He was unraveling. I watched his face shift as he read line by line, the light draining from his eyes with each sentence. My pulse thundered in my ears. Yes, now he would know the truth. But not all of it. Never all of it. His hands trembled as he scrolled, and I knew he was getting close. Close to that one message. The one I never meant to send. The one that explained everything, or ruined it beyond repair. Then, as if on cue, the phone buzzed in his grip. A new notification flashed across the screen. I saw his jaw tighten when he read the sender's name. He went still. Didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a nervous habit I'd had since childhood. My stomach churned. Regret burned in my throat. 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One mistake. But it was the kind that grows roots and pulls everything else down with it. Now, standing in the center of my quiet kitchen with a man who no longer knew who I was, I realized I couldn't run from what I'd done. So before I tell you the truth, all of it, let me ask you something. Have you ever kept a secret for so long it started to feel like a part of you? One you swore you'd carry to the grave, but then one day, it slipped? Write in the comments where you're watching from. And tell me, have you ever hidden something so carefully, only to lose control of it when it mattered most? I don't remember when exactly I stopped feeling like a woman in this house. It wasn't a single moment, more like a quiet erosion, the way waves smooth the edges of stone, slow and merciless. I woke up that morning, like many before it, to the sound of his alarm blaring at 6. He slapped it off without opening his eyes, rolled away from me, and muttered something about checking the weather. No kiss. No good morning. I lay there, eyes wide open, watching the ceiling and feeling like wallpaper, unnoticed, familiar, fading. Downstairs, the kitchen light was too harsh, and the coffee machine made an unsettling hiss. I made him coffee the way he liked it, 2 sugars, no cream. He didn't say thank you. Just took the mug and nodded, already scrolling through his phone with that half-furrowed brow that meant he was thinking about work or bills or God knows what else. I asked if he'd be home for dinner. He shrugged. Probably not. Late client call. That was all. No eye contact. I nodded, more out of reflex than agreement, and watched the back of his head as he left the kitchen. He didn't notice the dress I was wearing, new, navy blue, subtle but flattering. I'd chosen it hoping for something. A second glance. A pause. Nothing. The office was a different world. There was noise, chatter, movement, none of it warm, but at least it was distraction. I kept my head down, focusing on emails and reports, but my attention drifted when the HR team brought him around. The new director. Everyone stood a little straighter. He had that presence, calm, self-assured, but not smug. His handshake was firm, his eyes alert. When he was introduced to me, he paused for just a second longer than necessary. I've heard your name already, he said. You're the one who keeps everything running, right? I smiled politely, but something about the way he said it, the way he looked at me, like I was visible, made me feel slightly off balance. Like stepping onto a moving sidewalk. I didn't think much of it at first. Just a kind remark. But then came the meeting. He asked for my input directly. Not in a performative way, he genuinely listened. Asked questions. Wrote things down. No one had done that in a long time. I found myself speaking more than usual, sitting up straighter. When the meeting ended, he thanked me again. Our eyes met a moment too long. Not inappropriate. Just present. That night, my husband didn't ask how my day went. He came home, kicked off his shoes, mumbled something about dinner, and went straight to the living room. I made pasta. He ate it while watching the news. I didn't bother asking about the client call. Lying in bed, I stared at my phone longer than necessary, scrolling through meaningless posts, resisting the urge to check if the new director had sent a message, though I knew he hadn't. It was silly, I told myself. He was just polite. Attentive. But my body remembered the way he looked at me. My pulse had quickened then, a reflex I hadn't felt in years. Not since before the silence settled in our home like dust. The next day, I noticed he wore different ties than the rest of the men. Slim, textured, intentional. He spoke with clarity, his posture straight but relaxed. When he passed my desk and asked how the monthly report was going, it didn't feel like small talk. It felt like a real question. I answered, maybe a little too thoroughly, and when he smiled and said, "I like the way you think," I felt warmth rise in my neck. I told myself to get a grip. This was work. I was a married woman. But marriage, I was starting to realize, is not a force field. It's not armor. It's not even a promise, if no one remembers to keep it. My husband forgot our anniversary last year. I reminded him gently the next morning, and he said, "Oh, right. Sorry, work's been crazy." No flowers. No dinner. Just a grunt and a nod. That moment resurfaced in my memory now, uninvited and bitter. I buried it again. Over the next week, the new director's presence lingered. We passed each other in hallways. Exchanged occasional comments. Shared space in meetings. He complimented my ideas. Not my appearance, not overtly, but I noticed the way his gaze softened when I spoke. I started checking my reflection more before leaving the house. Subtle lipstick. Earrings. The navy dress reappeared. At home, nothing changed. My husband's world remained distant. I asked once if he wanted to go out Saturday, just the two of us. He shook his head. Maybe next week. Too tired. I laughed, but it didn't sound real. I realized I didn't remember the last time he touched me without it being an afterthought. I used to think love was a river, always moving, always finding a way. But lately it felt more like a pond. Still. Surface calm, but nothing beneath. That's why when I saw the director's name pop up in my inbox with a simple subject line, "Quick Chat," my heart didn't sink. It lifted. Just a little. Just enough. The subject line was simple, almost casual, "Quick Chat?" But my reaction was anything but. I stared at the screen for longer than necessary, my heart tapping a cautious rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't unusual for him to email me, we'd exchanged several about reports and planning. But something about this one felt different. Not the words themselves, but the timing. The tone. Or maybe it was just me, reading too much into everything, because for the first time in years, I was starting to feel noticed. I clicked it open. He wanted to review the updated metrics before the client meeting tomorrow and asked if I had 10 minutes after lunch. I read the message twice, then typed a short reply, "Of course. I'll bring the revised file." Professional. Polite. But my hands were warmer than they should have been. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of spreadsheets and conversations I barely registered. I kept checking the clock, trying not to be obvious about it. When noon hit, I packed the report, took a long look at myself in the mirror near the restroom, hair in place, lipstick light, enough but not too much, and told myself I was imagining things. That's all. His office was quiet, the blinds tilted just enough to soften the sunlight. He stood when I walked in and gestured toward the seat across from his desk. "Thanks for making time," he said, his voice steady but warm. I nodded, handed over the file, and tried to ignore how aware I was of the air between us, not charged, exactly, but dense in a way that normal conversation didn't usually carry. We went over the report first. He made a few notes, asked smart questions. I answered calmly, though I felt every word. He listened, really listened, nodding thoughtfully, occasionally lifting his eyes to mine and holding them just a second longer than necessary. When the document was fully reviewed and signed off, he closed the folder but didn't immediately move on. "You've got a way of clarifying things," he said. "It's rare." I thanked him, quietly. He smiled, then leaned back in his chair. "If I'm honest, I didn't expect to find someone here with your depth." I didn't know what to say to that. I'd been praised for competence, reliability, efficiency, but depth? That was different. It reached a part of me I didn't know had been waiting for exactly that word. "I just do what needs to be done," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "That's what I mean," he replied. "You don't make noise. But everything's stronger because of you." I noticed that. There was a pause. Not awkward, more like a held breath neither of us knew how to release. I glanced at the clock on his wall. "I should let you get back to your afternoon," I said. But I didn't move right away. He nodded slowly, then stood. As I rose too, our eyes met. Something flickered there, not intent, not suggestion. Recognition. Like something unspoken had been understood. I walked back to my desk in silence, sat down, and stared at the same email for 10 minutes without reading a word. My mind kept replaying the conversation, dissecting every syllable, every glance. What was happening to me? I wasn't a teenager. I was a grown woman, married for over 2 decades. But I couldn't remember the last time I'd been seen like that. Or heard. That evening, I made roasted chicken, his favorite. My husband barely looked up from his laptop during dinner. I asked how his day was. "Long," he replied, then muttered something about numbers not adding up in a quarterly report. I didn't press. I'd stopped pressing years ago. After he went to bed, I stayed downstairs, cleaning a countertop that was already spotless. My mind wandered. I thought about the director again. Not about his looks, though he was handsome in a quiet, grown-in kind of way, but about how he'd made me feel. Important. Not because of what I did, but because of who I was. That night, I dreamt I was on a train. The landscape passed too fast to recognize. I was alone in the car, watching my own reflection in the window. I looked like myself, and not. My lips moved, but I couldn't hear what I was saying. The next morning, I found myself choosing a blouse I hadn't worn in a long time, soft green, a gentle V-neck. Not revealing, just graceful. I paired it with small earrings I'd nearly forgotten I owned. I told myself it was for me. Not for him. That was a lie, and I knew it. But I let it slide. At the office, I focused harder than usual. I needed the control. He passed my desk once, nodded, and kept walking. I didn't know whether to feel disappointed or relieved. Later that day, we ended up in the elevator together. Just the two of us. We were both quiet for a moment. Then he asked how my weekend had been. I told him I'd done some reading. He smiled. "You strike me as someone who thinks even when you're reading." "I try," I said. The elevator dinged. We stepped out. He held the door for me. Our hands didn't touch. But I felt the nearness of his presence for minutes afterward, like heat left in a room after someone walks out. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from guilt. Not yet. It was something else. Something more electric. The feeling of a door opening in a place I thought was locked forever. I stood in the bathroom, brushing my hair slowly. Watching myself in the mirror. Noticing the curve of my shoulders, the line at the corner of my eyes. I wasn't young. But I wasn't gone either. I was still here. And someone had seen me. That alone changed everything. The next day, after a particularly long strategy meeting, he approached me again. There was a conference coming up in a nearby city, just 2 hours away by train. He said he'd need someone to help organize presentation flow, manage the post-session logistics. He asked if I'd be available to accompany him for the weekend. Work-focused. 2 days. He was careful with his words. I told him I'd think about it. That evening, I mentioned it to my husband. A work thing, I said. They're sending someone with him to help manage the materials. He asked if I could go. He didn't ask for details. Didn't ask who he was. Just nodded. As long as you're back by Monday. I stared at him for a moment, waiting for a question that never came. Upstairs, I packed a small bag. I told myself I was doing it because I was needed. Because I was good at my job. Because there was nothing wrong with being competent. Helpful. Present. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. I packed the soft green blouse. And I packed the earrings. The ones I hadn't worn in years. And I told myself I was only going for work. Even though I knew better. The morning of the trip came quietly, without fanfare. I was up before the sun, moving through the house with the kind of silence that comes from years of habit. I boiled water for tea instead of coffee. The kettle's hiss sounded louder than usual in the stillness. My husband was still asleep, turned away from me in bed, one arm flung over his pillow like a claim he'd long since stopped making. I didn't wake him. My suitcase was modest, just enough for 2 days. A pair of trousers, a blouse, some light makeup, and my notebook with all the files I needed. I packed carefully, deliberately. Nothing extravagant. Still, I paused over the green blouse again, wondering whether it was too much or not enough. I folded it neatly and laid it at the top. At the train station, the platform buzzed with the early energy of commuters and travelers. He was already there when I arrived, standing near a bench with his bag slung over his shoulder and a coffee in one hand. He noticed me immediately and smiled, not broadly, just a soft upward curve of acknowledgement. A quiet connection, like we shared something no one else could see. The train ride was uneventful in the usual sense. We talked about the presentation, the meeting schedule, the hotel arrangements. His voice was calm, measured, occasionally colored with humor that made me laugh more than I expected. But beneath every sentence lay something more, a current we both pretended not to feel. When we arrived at the conference center, the pace shifted. Colleagues, organizers, and industry people filled the halls with chatter and introductions. He slipped easily into the environment, greeting faces he hadn't seen in years. I followed close behind, blending in, staying useful, managing documents, checking the tech setup, adjusting schedules. It was easy to stay professional when I was busy. That, I knew how to do. It wasn't until later that the stillness came. After the first round of sessions and networking events, we found ourselves in the hotel lobby. The evening was winding down. Attendees dispersed in groups, heading to dinners or back to their rooms. He looked over at me, his voice casual. "You must be tired." I nodded. "A little." "Room service?" "Sounds perfect." We didn't say much in the elevator. Just stood side by side, facing forward, the quiet hum of the machinery carrying us upward. Our rooms were across the hall from each other, not adjacent, but close. I noticed that, and I don't think I was alone in doing so. Inside my room, I peeled off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands rested in my lap, still. The room smelled like fresh linen and wood polish, untouched and impersonal. I stared out the window for a while, watching the city lights blink in the distance. Below, streets hummed with late traffic. Life moved on. I ordered something small, grilled vegetables and rice, more to fill time than my stomach. While I waited, I changed out of my work clothes and into something comfortable but decent. I left the green blouse folded in my suitcase. The knock on the door came just as I was finishing dinner. Not room service. Him. He stood there with a bottle of sparkling water and 2 glasses. Thought you might want company. For a second, I didn't move. Then I stepped aside. He didn't sit right away. Walked to the window instead, looked out. City looks different from this height. It always does, I said, setting the glasses on the table. We didn't drink much. Just talked. About work. About life. About what it means to be the kind of person people rely on but rarely ask about. He said it like a confession, and I understood more than I should have. I told him I used to paint years ago. That I'd stopped without even noticing. He asked why. I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but I wasn't ready to say it aloud. Eventually, the silence grew heavy again. Not uncomfortable, just full. I stood, walked to put the glasses on the tray, and as I turned back toward him, we were closer than we had been all evening. We didn't move suddenly. Nothing rushed. It was a quiet gravity, a meeting of breath and understanding, the kind that doesn't need permission because it's built on everything unspoken. We kissed. It was brief, restrained, but undeniably real. My pulse fluttered in my throat. I stepped back before I could stop myself. I should get some rest, I said. My voice was even, but my hands weren't. He didn't argue. Just nodded once. Of course. At the door, he paused. Good night. Good night, I echoed. And then he was gone. I sat in the chair by the window for a long time after that. Not crying. Not smiling. Just still. It hadn't gone farther than a kiss. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. A line crossed, even if only in the heart. I knew what some people would say. That it was harmless. That nothing really happened. That there was no betrayal if nothing physical followed. But I knew better. The breach wasn't in the body. It was in the soul. In the choice to lean in when you should have stepped away. And I had leaned in. That night, I lay awake, the city outside flickering like a restless thought. I listened to the quiet hum of the building, to the faint traffic in the distance. My hands lay folded over my stomach, still. There was no guilt yet. Not fully. Just a weight. A knowing. A recognition that something had begun, and it would not be easy to undo. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from my husband. Hope the trip's going well. Don't forget to rest. I read it 3 times. Then I placed the phone face down and turned off the lamp. In the dark, I closed my eyes and told myself I still had a choice. But I wasn't sure if I believed that anymore. The next morning began earlier than expected. I woke before the alarm, the room still cloaked in pre-dawn gray. I lay there for a moment, unmoving, trying to gather my thoughts. The kiss hovered at the edges of my mind, like the aftertaste of a memory I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit. I hadn't dreamed. Or maybe I had and just didn't remember. Either way, waking felt heavier than sleeping. I sat up, ran my hand through my hair, and tried to shake the unease. The hotel room looked exactly as it had the night before. Neat. Unassuming. As if nothing had happened. As if it was just another business trip. Just another day. But something had happened. And I couldn't pretend otherwise, even if I wanted to. I took longer than usual getting ready. Showered slowly. Chose my clothes carefully. A dark gray blouse with clean lines, nothing suggestive, nothing soft. I tied my hair back tighter than normal and skipped the lipstick. I told myself it was professionalism. But I knew it was armor. At breakfast, the conference room was already half full. Plates clattered, conversations buzzed in low tones. I found a quiet table near the back and settled in with coffee and a small plate of fruit. He arrived a few minutes later, scanning the room, then walked toward me with that same measured ease he always carried. He asked if the seat across from me was taken. I shook my head. We didn't talk much. Just exchanged a few remarks about the schedule, the weather, the previous night's panel. It all sounded normal, but it wasn't. Not really. The silence between us now held more weight than the words. Later, during the keynote presentation, I sat 2 rows behind him. He turned once to glance at the audience and our eyes met for half a second. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't longing. It was acknowledgement. The kind that said, we're both still here. We both remember. Then he turned back to the stage. I focused on the presentations, took notes, organized the materials we needed for our session. I kept my hands busy. That helped. The motion, the tasks, the checklists, they gave me a sense of control. I was good at that. Always had been. By mid-afternoon, our part of the event was finished. We lingered a bit longer for networking and informal chats, but the main work was done. He approached me near the refreshment table and said we could head back to the city early if I preferred. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Let's go, I said. The train ride home was quieter than the one coming in. He read from his tablet. I stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past. Fields, warehouses, suburban rooftops. Nothing held my attention. My mind kept circling back to everything I couldn't say. I wondered if he was doing the same. When we pulled into the station, he offered to walk me to the taxi line. I thanked him. We stood there for a few moments, waiting. The sky was turning amber, city lights just beginning to flicker on. He turned to me before I stepped into the car. We crossed a line, he said simply. I nodded. Yes. We don't have to keep going. I didn't answer. Just looked at him. He didn't press. Just stepped back as the door closed. The ride home felt longer than usual. I watched familiar streets go by, each one layered with years of repetition, grocery runs, dry cleaning, weekend brunches. This was the life I had built. A life full of routines and responsibilities. But suddenly it all felt strangely detached, like I was observing someone else's memories through glass. At home, the lights were on. My husband was in the living room, half watching the evening news. He looked up when I entered and gave me a distracted smile. You're early, he said. Everything wrapped up ahead of schedule. He nodded. Dinner's in the fridge. I wasn't sure what you'd want. I thanked him and carried my suitcase upstairs. The bedroom looked exactly as I had left it. Nothing out of place. I unpacked slowly, mechanically. Put everything back where it belonged. Clothes in the hamper. Shoes in the closet. Toiletries in the drawer. Each motion was a small act of control, of normalcy. But inside, I didn't feel normal. Later that night, we sat at the kitchen table, each of us with a glass of water. We talked about the heating bill, the garbage schedule, his work deadlines. Not once did he ask about the conference. Not once did I volunteer. When we went to bed, he kissed me on the cheek. The contact startled me. It wasn't tender, but it was a gesture. One he hadn't made in a while. I lay awake beside him for a long time, listening to the sound of his breathing shift as he drifted into sleep. The next morning, life continued. Work. Errands. Emails. Deadlines. But something inside me had shifted, even if the outside looked the same. I couldn't explain it in any clear way, even to myself. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about escape. It was about being reminded of something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Something I wasn't sure how to find again within the boundaries of the life I'd chosen. At the office, things returned to their regular rhythm. We didn't avoid each other, but we didn't seek each other out either. When we spoke, it was brief and to the point. No extra looks. No lingering pauses. Professional. Polite. Distant. But the distance was constructed. Not real. Not empty. It was filled with what we weren't saying, with the choice we both made not to acknowledge what had happened. And yet, in every quiet corner of the day, I felt it, the echo of that moment, the quiet pulse of something just beneath the surface. And in the quiet hours of the night, I found myself replaying that moment again, not out of longing, but out of confusion. It had opened something in me. Not a desire for another man, not even necessarily for him, but for something I didn't yet have the words to define. A hunger to be known, perhaps. To be seen not for what I provided, but for who I was beneath all that. I didn't know where it would lead. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But I knew that something had begun. Not in a hotel room. Not on a train. But long before that, in the silence of my marriage, in the hollow space between routine and intimacy. And I also knew, with a clarity I couldn't explain, that it wasn't over. Not yet. The days that followed passed with the unsettling consistency of routine. Wake up. Make coffee. Answer emails. Attend meetings. Return home to a quiet kitchen and a husband who asked about errands but not about me. Each moment fit neatly into the structure of a life I had built carefully over the years, and yet nothing about it felt solid anymore. It was like walking through a house I'd lived in for decades and suddenly noticing that none of the furniture quite belonged to me. I didn't see him the entire Monday. We were on different project tracks that week, and that allowed space to breathe. Or at least that was the lie I told myself. But by Tuesday, our paths crossed again. It was late in the afternoon, long past the hum of lunch and close to the quiet lull of the day's end. I had stayed behind to finalize a report, wanting to get ahead before the weekend. Most of the office was emptying out, the clicking of keyboards tapering off one by one. He passed by my office, paused, and leaned on the doorframe. Burning the late hours again? I looked up and gave a slight smile. Trying to finish this forecast before the client call on Thursday. He nodded. Need help? I hesitated for a second longer than I should have, then gestured to the second chair in front of my desk. I won't say no. He stepped in, pulled the chair closer, and we worked through the numbers in silence, broken only by the occasional comment or shared glance at the screen. It was the kind of collaboration we'd done dozens of times before, but this time it was layered with something unsaid. Neither of us mentioned what had happened. Neither of us had to. After an hour or so, we finished. I closed the file, leaned back in my chair, and exhaled slowly. Thank you, I said, meaning it more than I expected. He nodded and looked at me, not through me, not past me, but directly. It was the kind of look that holds you in place even as everything else moves around you. I haven't stopped thinking about it, he said quietly. No context. No clarification. But we both knew. I looked down at my hands in my lap. I haven't either. We kissed. The words hung between us like something fragile. I nodded. Yes. We kissed. There was a pause. A long one. Then he stood. We should talk. We are talking, I said, though my voice didn't sound like mine. He gave a small shake of his head. No. I mean, we should actually talk. I didn't answer. He didn't press. He simply left the room, closing the door behind him without a sound. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I couldn't. My stomach was tight, knotted with something I didn't know how to name. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and stared at nothing in particular while my husband moved around me in slow, oblivious circles. He mentioned something about the garage door making a strange noise and that he might need to call someone. I nodded. He didn't notice that I hadn't touched my food. He didn't ask why my phone screen was dimmed and flipped over. He didn't even ask why I was still wearing my work blouse at 9:30 in the evening. When I finally got upstairs, I didn't go to bed right away. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, the long one near the linen closet, and looked at myself under the harsh white light. Not judging. Just observing. The lines near my mouth were more defined than they used to be. My eyes had shadows beneath them that hadn't faded in years. And yet, there was something alert in my expression that hadn't been there for a long time. A flicker. A quiet resistance to being invisible. The next day was uneventful on the surface. Meetings. Spreadsheets. A performance review that went longer than it should have. He kept his distance, and I did the same. We exchanged nothing more than a professional nod in the hallway. But everything changed on Thursday. It was a long day, heavy with back-to-back meetings and a high-stakes call that ran well into the evening. When it was over, most of the team packed up and left quickly, exhausted and eager to reclaim their personal time. I stayed behind again. So did he. I was gathering my notes when I felt the shift in the room. He walked in without knocking, his expression unreadable but not guarded. He closed the door softly behind him. You said we were already talking, he said. But that's not true. We're avoiding. I didn't respond. My body was still, but my heart wasn't. He sat across from me, no laptop, no tablet, just him. I don't want to make your life more complicated. I don't want to hurt you. But I also don't want to pretend that what happened didn't matter. It did matter, I said finally. It does. He exhaled. Then what do we do with that? It was the first time either of us had put it into words, the question that had been pulsing beneath every look, every silence. I didn't have an answer. Not then. Not fully. I looked at him. I think we keep pretending for now. Because I don't know what the other option looks like yet. He nodded. Slowly. Okay. We sat in silence for a while. Not the silence of avoidance, but of knowing. Of not needing to speak. Then I stood. Walked around the desk. And without planning, without thinking, I stopped in front of him. Our eyes met. No anticipation. No script. We kissed. It was softer than before. More certain. Not rushed or impulsive. Just real. Then I stepped back, turned toward the door, and left the room. The air outside the building was colder than I expected. Sharp. It pulled me out of the moment, reminded me of the world that still existed outside the four walls of that office. I got into my car and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. The dashboard lights glowed softly. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, not out of fear, but because I needed something to hold on to. That night, I didn't dream. My body was tired in a way that wasn't physical. And as I lay in bed beside a man who had no idea how far I'd drifted, I realized that I had passed a point I couldn't undo. I had chosen something, maybe not fully, maybe not clearly, but chosen all the same. And the weight of that choice pressed down on me long into the night. The weekend that followed arrived quietly, without questions. My husband had scheduled a golf day with an old college friend on Saturday, something he mentioned in passing over toast while flipping through a magazine. I nodded, pretending to listen, and cleared our plates as he spoke. He didn't ask about my plans, and I didn't offer any. That had become the rhythm of our weekends, parallel lives under one roof, intersecting only when necessary. After he left, the house felt like a paused memory. Everything in its place. The curtains hung just as they had for years, the armchair angled the same way it always had been, the faint smell of laundry detergent still clinging to the hallway. I walked through the rooms slowly, not cleaning or arranging, just noticing. This was the life I had spent years building, shelves filled with framed moments, closets full of seasons past, drawers that still held notes from another time. And yet, none of it felt like it was mine alone anymore. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. Work was the excuse, as it had always been. I told myself I was reviewing files from Thursday's meetings, organizing schedules, maybe getting ahead on the new reports. But after an hour, I found myself scrolling through an old folder of photos instead. There we were, me and my husband, smiling on a beach, squinting against the sun. I remember that day. We'd argued that morning about directions and then laughed over ice cream 2 hours later. Back then, everything felt temporary, frustrations, disappointments. Now, they felt permanent. Not loud, not violent. Just constant. Later that afternoon, I received a text. Not from him. From the man whose presence had quietly rearranged the architecture of my emotions. It was simple, I'm going to the coast tomorrow. Just for the day. Quiet place I go to clear my head. If you want space, just space, you're welcome. I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't reply right away. I walked away from the phone. I vacuumed the stairs. I folded laundry I didn't need to fold. I cleaned the inside of the fridge. But the message stayed. In the back of my mind. In the beat of my heart. In the silence of the house that no longer felt like shelter. That evening, I sat beside my husband while we watched a movie. Something we'd seen before, something comforting and safe. He leaned slightly toward me midway through, resting his arm behind me on the back of the couch. It was a gesture that would have meant something years ago. But now it felt like an echo, familiar but no longer real. When the credits rolled, I turned off the TV, mumbled something about being tired, and went upstairs. In bed, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling fan as it rotated slowly overhead. By morning, I had made a decision. I left a note on the counter, took a drive. We'll be back by evening. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the whole truth either. The highway was long and quiet. I drove with the windows down, the wind tangling in my hair, the radio low. The farther I got from home, the lighter I felt, not in the joyful sense, but in the way a person feels when they put down a heavy bag they've been carrying too long without noticing. When I arrived, he was already there. Parked beneath a grove of eucalyptus trees that leaned lazily toward the sea. The air smelled of salt and sun-warmed bark. The coast stretched endlessly, calm and unassuming. There were no crowds. No tourists. Just a few scattered locals walking their dogs or reading under blankets. He didn't say anything when he saw me. Just nodded and gestured toward the cliffside path that led to a secluded overlook. We walked in silence. The breeze wrapped around us, carrying the scent of the ocean and the faint rustle of dry grass underfoot. We sat on a bench overlooking the waves. Below us, the water moved with the rhythm of breath. Steady. Relentless. "I didn't think you'd come," he said finally. "I wasn't sure I would. I didn't plan this as a trap. I just needed air. I thought maybe you did too." I nodded, watching the horizon blur with light. "It's easier to breathe here." Neither of us spoke for a while after that. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It felt earned. Honest. "I used to come here a lot," he said eventually. "When things got complicated. It helps to see something bigger than yourself." I knew what he meant. The ocean has a way of putting things into perspective, of reminding you how much is outside your control, how small your secrets are compared to its depth. "I feel like I've spent years trying not to need anything," I said quietly. "To be dependable. Predictable. Solid. And somewhere in that, I forgot how to be me." He looked at me then, and there was no hunger in his gaze. Just understanding. A mirror. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I know you have your life. I see you. That's all." And for some reason, those words hit harder than any confession or plea could have. We stayed for hours. Walked the trails. Sat beneath a tree and shared a thermos of coffee he'd brought. No touching. No promises. Just space. And a strange sense of permission to be who we were when no one else was watching. When the sun began to dip behind the hills, I stood. I should go. He didn't try to stop me. Just nodded. "Thank you for coming." The drive home was quieter than the one before. The sky behind me burned gold and violet, and ahead the road curved slowly back toward the life I had left that morning. When I walked into the house, it was dark. My husband was upstairs, I assumed, as I set down my keys and poured a glass of water. The note I had left was still on the counter, untouched. Later, in bed, he asked if I'd had a good drive. "Yes," I said. "It was what I needed." He nodded in the dark and turned over. And I lay there, eyes open, knowing that something inside me had shifted again. Not because of him. Not because of romance. But because for one brief day, I had been fully, completely present with myself. No mask. No role. No obligation. And now, I didn't know how to return to pretending. There was something about the days that followed that felt too quiet, as if the air around me had learned to listen differently. My husband's presence was unchanged. He still kissed my cheek before leaving for work, still asked if I needed anything from the store, still watched the news with the volume too low, but I couldn't help but feel that he sensed something. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe that was the problem. That even now, even after all that had shifted inside me, I could still move through this life without drawing suspicion. As though my absence was a familiar pattern, easily overlooked. At work, I threw myself into tasks. Reports, meetings, deadlines, everything mechanical felt like a reprieve. I stayed late more often than I needed to, using the glow of productivity to blur the hours. He didn't question it. In some ways, I think he welcomed the quiet house, the frozen meals, the way we could live side by side without having to acknowledge each other beyond logistics. And yet, I was not alone. Not really. There was a moment, Wednesday, maybe, when I passed him in the hallway, and we both paused. A brief, silent acknowledgement. No words, no gestures, but the kind of pause that said, I know you. And you know me. Still. I didn't speak to him that day, nor the next. But each night, as I walked to my car, I found myself looking at the windows above, wondering if he was still inside, finishing emails or reading late. There was a strange comfort in that, in the knowing that someone else was thinking too much, too often. By Friday, the air had changed again. It started with a message. A simple one: there's a cabin outside the city. I sometimes go when I need to be nowhere. This weekend, I'll be there. You don't have to reply. I didn't answer. I didn't delete it either. Instead, I read it 3 times and left my phone screen lit on the table until it dimmed by itself. That night, my husband asked if I had any plans for the weekend. I hesitated. I thought I might visit my sister, I said. It came out more naturally than I expected. A quiet lie, wrapped in habit. He nodded, not looking up from his screen. Tell her I said hello. Saturday came like fog, slow, gray, and strangely peaceful. I packed lightly. Not like for a trip. More like for a pause. A sweater, a book I hadn't touched in years, a small notebook I used to write in before I forgot how to finish thoughts. The drive was long and winding. Miles passed like pages. The city slipped behind me, replaced by open fields and narrow roads bordered by rust-colored trees. The closer I got, the quieter it became. Not just outside, but inside too. When I arrived, the cabin stood quietly among the trees, modest, weathered, and honest. He was already there, stacking wood beside the porch. When he saw me, he didn't move right away. Just met my gaze with a kind of steadiness I hadn't realized I needed. I stepped out of the car, closed the door gently, and walked toward him. Neither of us spoke. He opened the door, let me in first. Inside, it smelled like cedar and old books. The fireplace had been prepared but not lit. A kettle sat on the stove, half filled. There were no questions. No explanations. Only presence. I set my bag down in the corner, removed my coat, and sat in one of the worn chairs by the window. The view stretched wide, untouched forest, a lake in the distance, and silence thick enough to wrap around your thoughts. He poured tea. Handed me a mug. Sat across from me. For a long time, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They arrive without drama, without music. Just quiet. Real. This was one of them. We spent the day in pieces. Walking along the trails. Sitting in silence. Preparing simple food without fuss. I found myself laughing once, genuinely, without filter, at something small, something forgotten minutes later. But the sound stayed. It echoed in my chest longer than it should have. Not because it was remarkable, but because it was mine. In the evening, we sat by the fire. The light flickered across the walls, dancing over shelves and floorboards. He handed me a blanket without a word. We listened to the wood crackle, to the trees moving in the wind outside. There was a moment when he looked at me, not with question, not with suggestion, but with something more fragile. Recognition, perhaps. And I understood. We didn't speak of home. We didn't speak of consequences. We didn't make promises or tear open old truths. There was only this night. This place. This strange breath of stillness in a world that never stopped asking for more. And somewhere in that moment, without needing to explain, without needing to name it, it happened. We spent the night together. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just simple. Just full. Later, lying in the quiet, I stared at the ceiling and counted the breaths I could hear, mine and his. The fire had dimmed, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like questions I wasn't ready to answer. I didn't sleep easily. Not because I was afraid, but because the weight of peace felt heavier than the weight of guilt. Morning came slowly, with pale light creeping through the curtains. I rose first, stepped outside with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The air was cold but clean. The sky wide and open. I stood there for a long time, watching mist lift off the lake, wondering what part of me had changed so quietly that I hadn't noticed until now. Behind me, the door creaked softly. Neither of us said anything. There was no need to. But I knew, deep in the marrow of myself, that nothing would be the same again. Not because of him. Not because of that cabin. But because I had seen myself again, without the masks, without the titles, without the measured smile. And now, returning to what was, would never be enough. I drove home with the windows rolled halfway down, letting the early autumn air thread through the car, cool and sharp. The roads were mostly empty, the trees already surrendering to the shift in seasons. Red, gold, brown. All of them letting go without protest. I envied them. Their clarity. Their quiet transitions. There was no hesitation in the way they changed. Inside me, however, everything was noise. The closer I got to the city, the heavier the world became again, buildings replacing trees, billboards shouting over silence, people moving faster than they seemed to live. The stillness of the cabin already felt distant, like something I had dreamed rather than lived. But my skin remembered. My breath did too. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as I'd left it. The porch light was on. The curtains closed. My husband's car sat in its usual place, unmoved. I sat in my own car for a long time, keys still in the ignition, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. Eventually, I got out, opened the front door, and stepped back into the rhythm I'd known for years. The hallway was quiet. A faint trace of cologne lingered in the air, his. The house was warm, too warm, as if the heat had been running all weekend without adjustment. I slipped off my shoes and walked toward the kitchen, where the light above the sink was still glowing. And there it was. My phone. Sitting exactly where I'd left it on the counter. But it was open. Unlocked. The screen was still faintly lit, the message I hadn't deleted still visible. The one about the cabin. My throat tightened before my mind could catch up. Then I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned. He stood there, barefoot, arms crossed loosely over his chest. He looked tired, but not angry. That was somehow worse. His eyes weren't demanding. They weren't wild. They were calm. Detached. But I could see the questions brewing behind them, even if he wasn't ready to ask them yet. I was looking for the grocery list, he said, voice level, quiet. Your phone buzzed while I was checking. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. He looked at me for a long moment. Then down at the screen again. Then back up. Do you want to tell me where you were? There it was. Not an accusation. Not yet. Just the beginning of the unraveling. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My mind raced through every possible version of the truth, every softened edit, every carefully constructed half-explanation. But each one felt like a betrayal of itself. I needed space, I said finally. From me? I looked at him. At the man I had shared a home with for more than 2 decades. At the man who had once known every version of me, and yet now couldn't seem to recognize the one standing in front of him. I needed space from everything, I said, softer. He nodded. Slowly. As if the words weren't new to him, but hearing them aloud gave them permission to exist. Was it him? He asked. The air in the kitchen changed. The refrigerator hummed in the silence. I didn't answer. I didn't confirm. I didn't deny. He exhaled through his nose and pressed his palms against the counter. I've had a feeling, he said. For a while now. I just didn't want to believe it. I felt something crack inside me, not guilt, not fear, but grief. Grief for the moment we had just crossed, the one we couldn't walk back from. He didn't yell. He didn't storm out. He just stood there, quiet and still, the weight of unspoken things pulling the corners of his posture downward. I don't know what to say to you, he said eventually. You don't have to say anything, I replied. But that wasn't true. We both knew it. That night, we didn't speak again. We went to bed without brushing against each other. Without even turning to look. I lay in the dark, eyes open, listening to the ceiling creak as the house settled above us. My body was tired, but my mind kept looping. Through every word. Every pause. Every look we had shared in the kitchen. In the morning, he had already left. His side of the bed was cold. The blanket barely moved. There was no note, no text. Just absence. And the echo of everything we had not said. At work, I moved through the day in a haze. The office lights felt too bright. The emails too loud. People passed me in hallways with nods and greetings, and I returned them automatically, the way you wave at someone you don't really see. I didn't see him until late afternoon. We passed briefly near the conference room. He gave me a quick glance, one that asked nothing and offered nothing. A shield. I recognized it because I wore the same one. Back at my desk, I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. I opened a new document. Typed a sentence. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. I had wanted clarity. Had craved it. But now that it was here, now that everything I had once feared had come to the surface, I didn't feel free. I felt suspended. As if my life had paused between breaths, and I didn't know what the next one would look like. That evening, I returned home to silence. He wasn't back yet. Or maybe he was avoiding being back while I was there. I heated soup, didn't finish it, left the bowl in the sink. I wandered through the house slowly, touching things as I passed, picture frames, doorknobs, the edge of the piano no one played anymore. I ended up in the guest room, the one we used for storage and seasonal clothes. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the old bookshelf in the corner. Most of the books hadn't been touched in years. I pulled one out at random. Pages yellowed, spine cracked. Inside was a receipt from a dinner 10 years ago. My name written in his handwriting. A note on the margin, "You looked beautiful tonight." I closed the book slowly. And for the first time in weeks, I cried. Not because I was ashamed. Not because I had been caught. But because I had once loved someone with every part of myself. And now, I wasn't sure if what remained was love or only memory. And I didn't know yet which one would hurt more to lose. The morning sun came through the blinds with an indifference that felt almost cruel. Light touched the floorboards, the walls, my hands, but it didn't reach me. Not in the way I needed. I sat on the edge of the guest bed where I had fallen asleep without intending to. My neck ached. My shoulders were stiff. But what hurt the most wasn't physical. It was that strange, hollow ache of knowing something had broken, quietly, and for good. Downstairs, the house was still. No footsteps. No clinking of dishes. No murmured news broadcast in the background. I checked the driveway. His car was gone. I stood in the kitchen with my fingers wrapped around a lukewarm mug, staring out at the backyard where the grass had grown too long. For a moment, I imagined what it would feel like to leave everything just as it was. Walk out with nothing. Let it all remain untouched. A museum of a life lived too long on autopilot. Instead, I drank the coffee slowly and then rinsed the cup as if routine could mend the cracks forming in my life. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I answered emails. Folded laundry. Replied to a message from a neighbor about the upcoming community meeting. None of it felt real. It was like being an actor in a play I no longer believed in. By early evening, the weight of silence became too loud. I went for a walk. Not anywhere specific, just out. The streets in our neighborhood were lined with trees, most of them starting to shed. Leaves crunched beneath my shoes as I moved aimlessly past familiar houses with tidy porches and Halloween decorations already half up. Normalcy on full display. I kept walking until the sidewalks changed, became cracked, uneven. The houses older, their yards less kept. I didn't know where I was going until I saw the coffee shop we used to visit. Years ago. Before life became something to maintain instead of something to feel. Inside, the chairs were the same. The chalkboard menu still slightly smudged. The girl behind the counter smiled at me like I was just another stranger. I ordered a tea. Sat near the window. Watched people walk by, each one lost in their own orbit. I wondered how many of them were carrying quiet disasters inside, like I was. I didn't stay long. When I got home, the living room lights were on. He was sitting on the couch, elbows on knees, hands clasped. He didn't look up as I walked in. Just waited until I set my keys down and stepped fully into the room. "I think we need to talk," he said. I didn't sit. I wasn't ready. He took a deep breath. "I've been going over everything. Over and over. And the truth is, I don't even know when it started. When we started fading." His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying disappointment long enough that it starts to feel like part of your posture. "I don't know either," I said. He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he already suspected. "I'm not going to ask you for details," he continued. "I think I've already heard enough, seen enough." I swallowed hard, but didn't interrupt. "I don't hate you," he added. "I wish I could. It would be easier. But I don't." I felt my throat tighten, and I turned away slightly, staring at a picture frame on the bookshelf, us on a hiking trail from years ago, arms around each other, squinting into the sun. "I didn't plan any of it," I said, voice quiet. "I believe you." That made it worse somehow. He stood, walked toward the hallway, then stopped. "I'll stay at my brother's for a few days. I think we both need time." I nodded, still unable to meet his eyes. "When I come back," he said, "we'll decide what happens next. Together or not." He didn't wait for a response. Just picked up a duffel bag by the door, already packed, and left. The door clicked shut with an almost imperceptible finality. I stood there for a long time, not moving. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Not just empty, but waiting. That night, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't read. I didn't make dinner. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper in front of me, unsure whether I wanted to write a confession, a goodbye, or nothing at all. Eventually, I wrote a list. Not of people. Not of reasons. But of feelings. Loneliness. Disconnection. Resentment. Craving. Guilt. Relief. Fear. Hope. All of them in one column, unranked, unorganized. Just there. And across from them, I wrote memories. Of when he brought home my favorite dessert without being asked. Of the time we both laughed so hard we cried during a road trip when the GPS sent us in circles. Of the night I sat on the porch alone while he worked late and didn't call. Of the morning I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd looked at me the way he used to. I stared at those two lists until the ink started to blur from the weight of my own pulse in my fingers. I folded the paper and put it in a drawer. Not to forget, but to remember. To sort through it all later, when I was ready. As I climbed the stairs to bed, the house felt unfamiliar. As if the walls were waiting for something to change. And maybe they were. Because deep down, I knew something had ended. But I also knew something else had begun. Not with him. Not even with the other man. But with me. And whatever came next, whether repair or departure, I would walk into it not as a version of someone I used to be, but as the person I was now. Quietly, steadily, painfully, finally, beginning again.